fax cards. He does our events management and various other things. Eric is our technology guy, so he's the one running the cameras. Rascal is our treasurer, and Grunt, our secretary, is unable to make it tonight. If you're interested in helping out, put on programs and build a stronger community with us, we'd love to chat. Our board is always looking for folks who are interested in becoming involved. Feel free to post about us on social media. Our Twitter is @SanFranciscoLDG. We're on Facebook at facebook.com/SFLDG. We're on YouTube, and please go to our website and get on our email list if you're interested, in case Facebook implodes or kicks us out or does something like that. Okay, now I'm going to introduce our program and our speakers today. My notes. So today we're going to talk about kink and neurodiversity. With us tonight to start out with is Richard Stroke, who many people know. He's a developmental research psychologist and co-founder of TASHRA, the Alternative Sexualities Health Research Alliance. He's currently directing research projects focused on identity development and health and well-being in people involved in kink and BDSM sexuality. He teaches at the Department of Human Development and Women's Studies at CSU, East Bay, and also does graduate level courses around the Bay. He also directs our LTG mentoring program and has been involved in stuff that we do in LTG for years and years and years, so we're happy to have you back. Anna Randall is also co-founder and executive director of TASHRA. It's a national nonprofit research alliance and clinical training organization. She's a doctor in human sexuality, a master's in public health, and master's in social work, and is a published researcher on lived experience. So welcome, thank you for joining us, and I'm going to turn it over to Miss Tim. Thanks, guys.
Okay, this is mostly meant to be a bit of a conversation, although I've got a lot of information I want to share at the start. Anna is a sex therapist and a clinician, and so I'm going to be turning to Anna for like examples of different cases that she's worked with. She also has a ton of information to share, so I'm asking her to jump in and do that whenever it's appropriate. And I'm asking you to please feel free to raise your hand, ask questions as we're going along. We're going to be talking in particular about this neurodiversity, which is still an evolving idea, an evolving umbrella as to what kinds of differences that it covers. The idea is essentially we're talking about differences in how brains are wired and how they're functioning, and how that leads to differences in understanding the world, interacting with others. We are going to focus for the most part on ADHD and autism tonight, but the umbrella covers things like sensory processing differences or sensory processing deficits. It covers, often a lot of people will consider bipolar and OCD and some other things to be part of the neurodivergent umbrella. So we may touch a little bit on those, but for the most part, we're going to focus on ADHD and autism. Okay. There's a lot we do not know and do not understand about neurodivergence. Let me just say, the whole term, neurodiversity, or if someone is neurodivergent, what that word is about is an attempt to talk about differences without assuming or using a framework that thinks there's like a problem, or there's a medical problem, or a biological problem. You know, the way in which we, especially as kinky leathermen, we are a little sensitive, and some of us run up against ways in which, you know, our sexuality is pathologized, that there must be something wrong. So, because of that, we're a little more sensitive, I would hope, to other kinds of differences, like neurodiversity. We have a little bit of data and a little bit of information from the research that we do that we want to share with you. It's just beginning to scratch the surface of this important, what we would call an intersection, right, between kinky sexuality and neurodiversity. So we're going to touch on all that. A lot of it's going to be driven by your questions and your experiences. Right? So if you have an experience to share, we will invite that. After the break, we're actually going to ask 3 people to come up and share in more depth their experiences and their viewpoints of being neurodivergent and in leather community. And we'll see where this goes. So, I've already mentioned that it covers a number of different things, including, actually what I did mention was people with learning disabilities and people who are gifted would also fall under the neurodiversity sort of umbrella. So we would want to include that. In fact, aspects of that, learning disabilities or being gifted, are deeply intertwined with things like ADHD and autism. So it's not a surprise that all of this would be kind of grouped together. So, first thing, I want to talk a little bit about ADHD, at least a few things. One is, first off, a lot of people misunderstand what ADD, ADHD really are about. There are a lot of characteristics.
Can you just explain what your acronym is for people who don't know all the words?
ADHD, Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, or ADD, Attention Deficit Disorder. Okay? Sometimes I might use ASD, or Autism Spectrum Disorder, but I generally just say autism. ADHD involves both some genetic factors, some early environmental factors, but essentially we're talking about a difference in how attention is managed. So this is sometimes part of what we would call executive functions. So executive functions are, part of the brain is constantly monitoring as to what should you pay attention to. When a surprising loud sound happens in your environment, right, your brain is assessing as to whether or not you should pay attention to it. Should it capture your attention? There's a number of things that go along with that kind of attention management and attention focus. Like, can you screen out distracting information, distracting experiences so that you can concentrate and focus on something? There's a lot of skill that goes into learning how to do that. And often what we find is that people whose brains work a little differently will have different experiences when it comes to what distracts them, how they resist interference from around their environment. And all of that will lead to then a very particular kind of experience of the world. And this can lead to a certain set of characteristics that a lot of people don't think of when they think of ADD or ADHD. So, sleeping problems, right? It kind of, if you start thinking about it, might make sense that people might easily, right, have difficulty falling asleep, staying asleep, being woken up, and sleep disturbances in turn can lead easily distracted the next day, can lead to, there's a very strong relationship between sleep problems and depression. So a lot of ADHD people, ADD people experience a lot of like depression and then anxiety. So there's a lot of things that are going on that are often related, right, to ADD or ADHD. But the core of it really is this management thing. So it can lead to expressions like being easily distracted, thinking something, having, in fact, an amazing thought. You've completely solved the world's problems, and then it's gone, right? Because your mind is on to something else. Your mind is focusing on something else. Sometimes it can be hyper-focus, right? They're concentrating on something, and they're really into it, and there's nothing in the environment that seems to be able to pull their attention away. So it's both hyper-focus and non-focus. Because again, how attention itself is managed works differently. And so the ways in which we would normally, like, I can focus, but if something happens, I can go pay attention to that, and then I can come back. Because my attention hasn't completely left the first thing, right? My memory helps me to come back to what it was I was working on. So that ability to switch, focus, and come back often is challenging for people with ADHD, and so they get distracted, and then their brains don't quite know what to focus on. What was I focusing on? And then all of that can lead to then some issues with learning. And so there's a couple of things that go with that. One is often ADHD can build up and become or lead to a learning disability, dyslexia, a whole host of other learning disabilities that are not what we would traditionally think of as ADHD. But ADHD is a contributor to a lot of those things. It makes us vulnerable to actually developing other learning disabilities. On the plus side, because your attention is all over the place, you can make connections between things that other people are not paying attention to. And so what we find is that people, kids with ADHD or ADD, actually score very, very high on creativity. They're seeing things differently. So, that's a little bit of some core aspects of ADHD.
Well, I think one thing to describe is the idea that many people don't understand that there's, when we look at the kind of diagnostic criteria of this, because I'm a clinician, so I'm going to talk about the diagnostic criteria. There's 3 types of ADHD, okay? We talk about what's called kind of the classic form of ADHD, this kind of hyperactivity form of ADHD. This is the kind of, when we look at a child, we're talking about somebody who's kind of bouncing off the wall, a kid who kind of can't sit in their seat, right? Is easily distracted, has trouble following directions, has trouble following through on things, loses their homework, things like that, okay? And the data seems to show that men are much more, cis men are much more prone to ADHD and particularly the classic form of ADHD. The secondary form of ADHD, which is called inattentive, is a form of ADHD that has not gotten a lot of attention until probably the last 15, 20 years. It's often a form that is not diagnosed until later in life. And in particular, we see it a lot in women, or we see that a lot in individuals who are genetically, this is a question, it's interesting because they're always talking about men and women in science. We have not done a very good job over the years of distinguishing other ways of describing in the research anything other than this kind of binary of male and female. So I will be talking about this as male and female, and I don't need to kind of exclude that that's kind of the data that we have. But that women tend to be undiagnosed with inattentive. But what I see a lot is also men. I see individuals who, inattentive is this, the characteristic of inattentive is someone who misses things. They have a focus on the kind of general whole. They can see a lot, but they miss details. So they may be somebody who may miss a lot in homework, like little details. They may make misspellings, or they may miss letters or words in things. And what happens is, particularly since women are often socialized to, it's like to get along, right? They're not seen as being difficult. They're not seen as kind of bouncing off the walls. So they're often missed, right? And what I see is also, I see this with individuals who may have been raised male also, or maybe, in that if they're pleasing and they get along and they're well behaved, they're seen as a little bit flaky, or they're seen as a little bit, have a little trouble kind of focusing and things like that. But there's somebody who is, I'm diagnosed as ADHD, and I was diagnosed relatively quite late. I was diagnosed only in the last 10 years. And one of the things that when I went in to see my psychiatrist about this, who had been treating me for years with depression and a variety of other things, he said, I just have one question for you. What did your room look like when you were a kid? And I said, my room would look like a bomb went off in it, right? And then I would clean it up, and I would make it absolutely perfect. I would put everything away, I would label it, I would put everything on the shelf, and I would swear I was never going to do it again. I can see people nodding, right? And then 3 days later, it would start to fall apart again. And I would feel so much shame about it, so horrible about it. And what was so hard was, here I was, late in life, recognizing that I had been carrying around something that had never been diagnosed. I had trouble writing notes in classes. I would fall asleep while I wrote notes in classes. Because for me, my form of ADHD is that my brain flips out when things are boring, when things are too rote, when things have too much kind of regularity to them. I would just flip out. So God forbid that there was somebody talking in front of the class who was like droning on, right? I would literally tune out. My notes would fall, right? And so this inattentive style often gets missed in diagnosis until later in life, when life falls apart for people. When they have enough stressors that all the coping strategies that they put in place in their lives, right, to kind of manage life, suddenly fall apart. So somebody suddenly, 5 years of taxes don't get done. Suddenly, they go through a divorce, or they go through some sort of major life crisis, and they are a disaster emotionally, and their kind of way of living falls apart as well. The third type of ADHD is a combined type. So those are the individuals who have both kind of classic and also this inattentive. Okay? So I wanted to kind of cover that just to give you all a sense of that. Because I think that that's an important thing to understand, is that when people often are diagnosed, particularly later in life, or when they start to re-look at their ADHD later in life, because many people get this diagnosis young, some of them get treated, some of them don't. Sometimes they kind of manage life pretty well, and then life gets hard later, and now they go, oh shit, I need to go back and look at this diagnosis that I had way ago. And one of the things that often will come up is depression. Because what's happened is over the years, holding this kind of way of being where they've had to walk through life covering up the fact that they lose things, that they can't get their car fixed, that they have trouble with impulsivity, right? That they may have an addiction issue or whatever, causes them to have tremendous negative self-talk, right? And that depression really builds for many people. And so there's this comorbidity with depression, there's this comorbidity with other kinds of mental illnesses, which then later they'll go back and kind of treat later as an adult.
When it comes to sex and ADHD, there are a few things. I don't think you would be surprised by any of these. Generally, people with ADD and ADHD have higher levels of sexual desire, higher than the average person. They masturbate a lot. I don't know what a lot is, but supposedly it's a lot. They also will experience sexual dysfunctions more often than the general population. And, erection problems, lubrication problems, all sorts of things. And generally it's because, again, there's a lot that, where, you can imagine that a lot of sexuality does require a certain kind of a sustained attention and not a lot of distraction. If the sex is a little bit too boring, you might fall asleep in the middle of it, or at least your body will. So,
And certainly get distracted, right? How many people in here have found that, if your brain is suddenly distracted by over here, the idea of arousal can't come up, right? If what you're suddenly thinking about is either the noise outside or what happened at home earlier, right? The idea of arousal just doesn't bubble up anymore.
People with ADD, ADHD are more attracted to consensual non-monogamy. Seems to fit, I would say. So, in our Kink Health survey back in 2016, we asked about a couple thousand kinksters a whole bunch of different questions, and some of them were about, have you been treated in the last 12 months? Have you ever been treated and we asked about a whole bunch of things, including ADD, ADHD, and autism. And what we found was that the level of people who've been treated for ADD or ADHD in the kink community is the same as in the general population, roughly about 6%. Right? 4% said in the last 12 months. So, you're talking about, 1 out of 15 people or so. There's more than 15 people in this room. I imagine there's a few people with ADD or ADHD. We looked specifically at health experiences. So one of the things we asked was, have you ever been injured in a BDSM scene? And those people who said that they had ADD or ADHD had more injuries than the average kinky person in our study. Slightly more. It would be about 2 out of 13 ADHD kinksters, but 2 out of 15 of the neurotypical, or at least those people that were treated. So slightly higher, but still noticeably higher. Lower numbers of ADHD kinksters are out to their current medical provider than the average kinkster. They don't talk about it with their doctors or with their healthcare providers. They are more likely, though, to come out to their therapists or counselors. And you can imagine it. And probably dealing with some aspects of ADD or ADHD would probably lead to discussions of sexuality.
Sorry, just clarification. You said less are out to the medical provider, more out. When you say out, do you mean out as kinksters or out as gay? Okay.
I'm Steamsters. Substance use. Overall, in our sample, in the last 3 months, 42% of kinksters had sex while they were high or on drugs. 42% in the last 3 months. But people with ADD, ADHD, it was not 42%, it was 48%. So it's a little bit higher. And in particular, marijuana. The average in our sample of kinksters was about 30% in the last year have used marijuana. ADHD people, it was 51%. So not 30%, 51%. And again, we know that a lot of people with ADD and ADHD self-medicate. So we're really seeing that when we look at that intersection between kink and sex and drug use. Now, there's also a lot of ways in which BDSM in particular seems to help people with ADD and ADHD. And it gives them coping skills, and it gives them a great experience in particular, as opposed to just, the vanilla sex. So some of the things that have been pointed out by people include when you're in a dynamic, right? When you're in a power exchange dynamic, you have to talk a lot about what are the rules, what are the protocols, what are the boundaries of this power exchange. And that dynamic and talking about it helps to create really clear expectations. So you're not constantly thinking like, well, is it this, is it that? What if this, what if that? The clear expectations really cuts through a lot of the distractions or things that might distract. A lot of power exchange also circumvents any kind of executive function problems. So some executive function problems are like having to make a decision. Well, if you're in a power exchange, and somebody else can make that decision, and you just go with it. Play is definitely a way to help manage that understimulation, overstimulation aspect. Lots of different scenes, sensory deprivation, blindfolds, different things to actually create more sensations so that you don't get completely distracted and bored. BDSM is adaptable to my brain. That's what someone said. Yes, you can find different ways of doing a whole bunch of different things that really fit that person. Maybe they need to be, flogged at this speed, right? This level of intensity, this fast, this slow, so that it really fits them. The way in which their brain is really processing all of this stuff. So, we do find that a whole range of BDSM scenes can be adjusted and shifted so that they really do fit the person. And there's a lot more options, right, than you would find in just sort of straight vanilla sex. I mean, how many ways are there to give a blowjob? Somebody will tell you. A lot of people really talked about how BDSM has helped because it has helped to learn that self-acceptance. A lot of what Anna was talking about that shame, that build-up, right, of embarrassment and shame over some of the challenges and difficulties. Coming to terms with your kinky sexuality is coming to terms with yourself. And that can include, and for a lot of people it has included, coming to accept the way in which their brains work, and the way in which they experience sensation and their environment. So all of those have been actually really important things, and a lot of people with ADHD find, and even, they're not like rushing to kink and leather and BDSM, but when they're here, they find that it helps a lot.
Would you say, I mean, in your survey, I'm going to guess that people who identify as ADHD tend to skew more on the bottom sub-master side, or is it evenly split? Or, I mean, is it similar to, or did you not even ask that question?
We didn't pull that data.
Let me think. I did pull the data for the autistic, which is about even.
And the reason why I said, like, you keep describing, like,
Yes.
someone else to control, someone else to give executive function.
You know, actually, I didn't pull those numbers. I'm trying to remember. I want to say it was slightly more bottom, but not, not overwhelmingly. So, anybody here want to talk about being a top and having ADHD? We might hear about that later. I don't know. But there does tend to be, at least with ADHD, slightly bottom.
This is really important. He's mentioning shame as being a big part of ADHD.
Yeah.
And one of the main ways I've found it as an antidote to shame is not with sunlight. If you're ashamed about something and you tell the world about it, well, what? It's just you. And in the kink community, it's a lot easier to tell the world, or at least the kink world.
Yes.
I think it's one of the things, you know, what you're mentioning around shame is so vital because we know that there's absolutely something called rejection dysphoria. It's rejection sensitivity dysphoria. People with ADHD are really, really prone to take any kind of criticism poorly. And I'll tell you, when I work with my clients with ADHD, when I can tell them that they don't, that it's not that they're too sensitive. This is part of the symptomatology of ADHD is really taking any kind of criticism comes in a really, really sharp and really, really painful way. And so understanding that about yourself, it's not because you're too sensitive. It's because this is the way your brain operates. It hears these things. They come in and you take them deeply personally. And so one of the things in understanding about kink, or about kink relationship and about your relationship is people with ADHD, if they're in, let's say, a DS relationship, you know, and that they're going to be prone to want to work out of not out of a punishment model. They're going to work out of a praise model, right? They're going to work. They're not going to do well with criticism. They're not going to do well with that, and so because that rejection dysphoria is really going to hit them harshly. And so knowing that about yourself, that means, you know, if you're negotiating and you're letting somebody know about yourself and negotiating your relationship with them, you know, that's the way you're going to respond. So if you've got somebody who's in a position of authority over you, who's harsh and trying to kind of come down on you hard, because that's the way they roll, it may not be the best fit for you.
Another thing that's really critical is the difference between guilt and shame. Guilt is about something you did. Shame is about something you are. If I were to tell you you're drunk, that's a guilt statement. It's either true or false. It says nothing about whether it's going to be true tomorrow or whether it was true yesterday. But if I were to change it very slightly and say you're a drunk, that's a shame statement because I'm making a statement about your network of humans.
And talking about something that, and this is the thing, one of the things I really want to get across tonight is when we talk about this neurodivergency, there's just such a huge range of characteristics. And so some of these characteristics also change over time. So some days you might be having a really hard day when it comes to your neurodivergence. And some days it'll be much easier. Some days the distractions will be overwhelming and other days you're fine. And it will be different across different people. So when you say something like, you are a drunk, or you are a, fill in the broken person, language, when it comes to something like ADD or ADHD, that can be devastating. Because again, it assumes there's something about you that will not change, that cannot change, that will always be the same. And in fact, that's not how our brains work, right? That is not how neurodivergence works. That's actually not how any brains work. So statements like that can be, they're wildly off base, as well as deeply shaming. So now you've really got two things, right? Now you've got the shame, and now you've got a really distorted view of the world, and a really distorted view of yourself that is not reality-based.
Some of us are real good at turning a guilt statement into a shame statement, just in our brain.
Well, that's what
That, you might say something that's a guilt statement, and your brain will say, no, shame.
it's about.
Yes, yeah.
I hear the terms, words like disorder or broken. And are all of these things all, to use the word, bad?
I think it's a superpower personally.
That's
I'm all about this as a superpower,
I am too.
right? I'm all about this as highly creative, expansive thinkers, people who think outside the box, right? People who are risk takers, right? People who really, they're always striving to be better. There's a kind of, there's always an attempt to try and do better, right? Which can be seen in this really negative way. I mean, we roll this out in this way that's like this disorder, and there's this impairment and whatever, and I really don't frame it that way. I don't want to frame it that way. I mean, there's a way I have to diagnose it because I do it, because that's what I do, because I have to put these things on paper. But when I'm working with somebody, I really want them to see that this is something to understand about yourself, so that you can learn how to use the superpower you have the best you can, right? And that's why it's hard for me sometimes, because people are not doing some of the really helpful stuff, which is learning about this. There's so many resources out there. There's ways to manage yourself. There's ways to know what it is. If you're somebody who needs to be better organized, it's like, I know that I do well on pieces of paper, right? So for me, it's like, I want to put something down on paper, right? But knowing like I'm that person who puts it down on paper, somebody else may work best in a different form. So it's good to know the different, it's like, go out there, learn what's out there. Get onto the forums, go on into chat, go on to ADHD Attitude Magazine, go to ADHD podcasts. There are so many resources out there for folks. And I think that there should be more resources in our community. Because I honestly think there's more ADHD and ADD and autism in this community than the data that we have, our limited data shows.
But at the same time, for a lot of people, like, this is a disability. It is disabling, not having these functions that the world expects you to have, and especially when there's not adequate support. Like, that part is not the same power.
And how often I'm telling somebody in their workplace that if it is that for you, if it really becomes difficult for you, there are ways to ask for accommodations at work, right? So if you're somebody at work, it means that you may need an executive assistant if you're in a position to be able to have one. And how often people are like, I can? And I'm like, absolutely. If you're in school, getting someone to write notes for you in school so that you're not doing it for yourself. Things like that, just knowing what the accommodations are that you need, because for many people this can be absolutely impairing to the point that they really struggle. And yet at the same time, I hear people who, a doctor will say to them, you can have ADHD, you graduated, but you have a PhD, you have ADHD, right? I mean, I hear that.
Maybe look at the rest of my life, right?
It's like mind-blowing.
A little tip though, if you have ADHD and you're a dom, You know, one of those things is about like making decisions, and you can get paralyzed, right, with all of these options. Ask yourself, give me 3 options. Give me 2 options. I'll pick. Much easier. If you know that's how your brain works and that's how it works best.
Questions are incredibly awful.
Yes. So there are ways, once you are aware of it, right, this is how my brain works, then to work with it, right, to figure out those coping things, and that includes, you know, doing kink and BDSM.
2 points. One is that the naming of the use of the word disorder, part of the, well, a lot of the ADHD community hates that for kind of obvious reasons. And a good reason for it existing is that the drug companies want to sell stuff. And they have a disorder, they can sell something to fix it.
Which leads me to medication.
The other thing that I wanted to mention about work and accommodations is saying you have ADHD in a work environment is kind of like coming out as gay or kinky or something. It's not something you can unsay.
Right.
So you want to be careful about it and think through it. Maybe ask, say, I have a problem with distraction, so put away from the window over in the corner. That kind of thing. So you don't have to say anything. Because everybody's idea of ADHD is different. And they're going to bring in their own stereotypes about what it means and completely mislabel you because yours is different than what they think it is. And you don't have time to educate it. It's not your job. But you don't want to buy into their stereotypes.
Can you do medications?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to ask just a question about your survey, which seems to be very interesting, and although we've seen a little bit of it. Could you comment on its limitation in terms of the data that you've got and how you will improve that or so that we will get better information? But 2 questions. And the second one, you talked about people who have ADHD treatment, who were on treatment in the last year. Do you have any sense of how many people had the symptoms or signs of ADHD from that survey that were not on treatment?
So the one limitation of the survey is that we asked a whole bunch of questions and everything was about a quarter inch deep. So we didn't get a lot of detail, but we got a lot of topics covered, which is what we had planned to do because we needed to explore the terrain. So we needed a very high level viewpoint of kink and health. So we don't, but we can ask in the future, like, you know, do you have these particular symptoms? Do they impact your quality of life or not? What do you do to cope? We can ask all sorts of questions to really start to get into deep, but the 2016 survey was limited in that. There's some other limitations, but that's main.
So when we talk about treatment, so bringing up the treatment issue, you know, I think we look at treatment in a couple different ways. One is we look at treatment kind of in the medical model is this idea of medication, right? There's also the idea of kind of behavioral treatment, which is individuals who get help on how to like walk through life with managing the symptoms behaviorally. The third way of treatment is lifestyle treatment, which is exercise, which is incredibly important to individuals with ADHD and ADD. Exercise, supplements. There's a great deal being done around supplements right now. There's some really, really strong evidence that omega-3 fatty acids are highly effective on with managing particularly milder forms of ADHD. Right? I have a whole list of supplements, and there's a lot of genetic testing that's being done these days to look at individuals around what medications they're sensitive to, and also what supplements might be beneficial for them. When it comes to medications, you know, I think unfortunately medications. I mean, I really believe that medications can be incredibly effective for people. People are some people are very resistant to it. I think that medications can benefit people in ways that can be life-changing for individuals. And there are generally, we look at medications as, there are stimulants and non-stimulant medications. The stimulant medications that they're kind of the first line. 70 to 80% of people have some response to them. That there are around 29 or 30 FDA-approved stimulant medications. Most of them are either methylphenidate or amphetamines. Those are the kind of two medications, there's kind of two molecules that are used. And they tend to reduce hyperactivity, distractibility, and impulsivity, right? And the medications, those are Adderall, Vyvanse, Ritalin, Focalin, Polivent. Those are the ones that are the stimulant medications. The non-stimulant medications, there is about 20 or 30 that it doesn't work well with. And those people will kind of move over to non-stimulants. Those also will lower distractibility, impulsivity, and hyperactivity in the people that they're effective to. The medications people often think of those are Strattera, Capve, guanfacine, which is also called Intuniv, and then there's a new one called Quellbri, it's a brand new one. Wellbutrin also can be used as kind of for milder forms of ADHD. So those are kind of the standard medication when we're looking at pharmaceutical medications. But there are people who are responding well to these supplements that people are getting. There are people who've gone off of medications completely and are just using supplements. Some of the supplements that people are using are phosphodiesterone, zinc, fish oil, NAC, which is acetylcysteine, whatever, magnesium, tyrosine, and SAM. And there's a lot of new push towards supplements. Finally, we're actually looking at those, right? But the big ones are lifestyle, is making sure that you're doing that in addition to these things. You know, when you're not exercising, when you're not watching your diet, when you're not sleeping well, sleep is huge, huge. And since sleep disorders are fairly common, it's really important. And the challenge is that people with ADHD often need routine, but they resist routine. Because routine, once you've done it long enough, it gets boring, so they have to shift. So understanding that in your kink relationship is important too, because it's like if you're in a relationship where you have routine in your relationship, shift it up, change it up. Because chances are they're going to fall off their routine. Because at some point it's going to start losing its workability for somebody with ADHD, because they're going to start to kind of get bored by it and lose interest in it.
I want to cover autism before
Yep.
the break. So I'm going to go quickly through autism, and then we'll take a break, and we'll do a panel. All right. So autism, there is, like ADHD, a large range of different characteristics that often go with it. Roughly, we're talking about 1 to 2% of the population. In our 2016 Kink Health study, it was 1% of our sample had some sort of treatment for autism. There's a couple of things about it that stick out. Everybody probably, has some idea about what some of the classic characteristics are. But some of the ones that I tend to focus on because other people don't is, one, problems with nonverbal communication. Everybody's, always talking about that. Talk is difficult, and it is. But nonverbal communication is even harder. So reading body language, reading emotions on the face, reading all of that stuff is very, very difficult, often challenging for an autistic person. Autistic people also become non-speaking when they're overwhelmed with sensory information. So even someone who may not appear to have an issue with talk will, if they are overstressed, or overstimulated suddenly go nonverbal. There is quite a range of things. Reciprocity is sometimes a big issue. It's sort of like that turn-taking, what is an appropriate or socially acceptable way to respond to something. This idea of these kinds of routines can be very, very difficult. The idea here, one last thing about it is, autistic people show a very amazing range of gender and sexual orientation diversity. Agender, non-binary, transgender, cisgender, I mean, just a huge range of gender and sexual orientation for people who are autistic. And that, raises a lot of really interesting questions. Past research has found that either somewhere between 5 and 15% of the furry community are on the spectrum. It's 2% of the general population, 5 to 15% of the furries. Why? And when you talk to an autistic furry person, what you often find is that the actual furry costume does a couple of things. One is, it removes the need to read all that nonverbal body communication. Now I don't have to try to read from your body position and your face and everything else like that, what's going on. So it relieves that difficulty. The second thing is that, of course, having on a suit blocks a lot of sensory information, blocks a lot of sensory stimulation. And so it allows people to interact with others in a way that's not overwhelming. So those are just a couple of things. Autism itself, there's like 10,000 theories about what it is and why it develops. One in particular is one big brain difference that has been seen in many, but not all, autistic people, is sort of like hyperconnections in certain parts of the brain, but lower connections in long distance across the brain. So the brain is sort of hyper-connected, but also very separate. And this leads to a very different kind of experience, learning experience, and interpretation of the world. So one of the my current favorite theory right now is the predictive coding theory. And it's the idea that a neurotypical person will first pay, when you're learning something, will pay a lot of attention to all of the sensory information, and you're trying to learn this skill, you're trying to learn about this place, you're trying to learn it, so you're paying a lot of attention. And as you learn, you start to build up a mental model of that skill, of that place. And pretty soon, you're really paying more attention to the mental model in your head than the actual sensory information, right? So that's why I can look at my dad and go, "Did you just grow a mustache?" And he's like, "I've had it for 5 years. What are you talking about?" That's because my mental model of my dad doesn't have a mustache, right? So neurotypical people spend a lot of time paying attention to the ideas of the world that they have. Autistic people seem to easily get distracted and overwhelmed by that sensory information. And so they're especially challenged to come up with a mental model of a lot of things, which of course then makes understanding other people really difficult. It's like, I don't get you, right? I don't have a good mental model. I'm very attracted to all of the sensory stuff that's going on right here. And trying to make sense of that can be very difficult when you can't pull yourself back from that sensory experience or that sensory overload. So, there is this way in which our brains, over time, as we experience something over and over again, start to really not pay attention to all the detail. The idea is that there's a part of our brain that is really like, okay, you've seen that, okay, you've seen that, okay, you've seen that, okay, you got it. You don't have to pay attention to it anymore. And that helps to create that mental model. So the idea that some people might have difficulty with that is going to impact a lot of different ways in which they interact with others and which they understand the world. So this idea does explain some of the things about autistic characteristics. And in some ways, it sounds to me there is a kind of like similarity with some of the other things under the neurodivergence umbrella, the sensory processing difficulties that some people have, the ADHD, right, and being overstimulated. Those people who are highly sensitive get overstimulated. So there's a lot of ways in which problematic behavior is really this expression of this sort of sensory overload. And I hope that kinky people can understand the importance of sensory information and maybe even sensory overload, and how to cope with that. So that's just a little bit about autism. There's a lot more that could be said, but we are at time for a break.
Thank you. We'll take a 10-minute or so break, 10-15 minutes. We'll yell at everybody to come back when it's time. Feel free to grab some snacks, use the restroom, all that sort of stuff. What's that?